and welcome to A Word with Ward. I'm Representative Gene Ward, and we're here today to talk about your favorite subject, your money, your state budget. And at a time of the year when the budget crunch is on, it's going to be hopefully all you wanted to know about your state budget and some of the things that may or may not be in it that you will, after this session, be able to know. I first want to introduce my Chief of Staff, Office Manager, Ms. Fukumoto, who is going to be the one who directs a lot of the information on this program. I should also mention that she is also a graduate of UH Manoa.
Yes.
What did you study at University of Hawaii?
American Studies and Sociology.
American Studies and Sociology. Now I understand also you just passed the LSAT at the 98th percentile, and the rumor is you're going to go to Yale School of Law.
We'll see if they let me in.
Anyways, this is Beth Fukumoto, and with Beth and myself, we have for the first time realized a budget proposal that we put together, not with the Finance Committee, not with the House Caucus, but for 10 years I've been always wanting to get into the budget to make something interactive, transparent, and something that you, the people, can have a handle on and a look at. And what we're going to do today is talk about the budget in general and then specifically go into the budget that we have proposed called the Republican Balanced Budget Proposal. And that's what we're going to end with. But we're going to begin with just the generic thing. What about the budget? What's the state budget, Beth? Let's start out with a real easy one, definitional thing. What's a state budget?
I guess this was my first experience with the state budget. I would say that it's just like any other budget any family has to make. It's the money that you're getting in versus the money that you're spending.
So just like you have your family budget and know what you can spend, what you can't spend, your state has a budget. And how big is the budget that we have?
We're looking at billions of dollars. I think maybe about $5 billion in revenues.
If we talk about the revenues from the people of Hawaii, it's about $5 or $6 billion,
Yeah.
and then the feds give us about another 40%. So we got about a $10 to $12 million budget.
Yeah.
That's a chunk of change. That's a considerable amount of money, and again, why it's so important that you know where this money comes from and how it's spent. Speaking of which, where it comes from, do the people of Hawaii put those $5 or $6 billion out of their pocket into this budget?
I would say the $5 billion, definitely. Obviously, the federal, trickles back in other ways, but yeah.
And that $5 billion, $6 billion comes primarily from every time you pay the GT tax, you're paying almost half of what your state spends. And then the other large proportion, probably another 30+%, is from your income tax. So if you add GT tax at 4%, or if you're on Oahu, 4.5%, and then income taxes, you will see that that's basically where your budget comes from. Now there's other fees, there's other corporate taxes and smaller amounts, but if you basically take GT tax and income tax, you have the lion's share of what comprises the state budget, which is $10 to $12 billion. Even though we're a state of only 1.3 million people, we have a budget considerably of considerable size. Now the real question is, the people who pay into the budget, they want to know, how do we spend it? What are some of the major spending categories that the budget would go into?
We spend a lot of it on human services. A lot of it is healthcare costs for the unemployed and the underemployed. What else do we spend? Education, obviously, is a huge part of our budget. Yeah.
In fact, some have said, just by what you had just spoken of, if we put education lower and higher, the human services and health, we've got literally 80% of the budget. 80% of the budget with just those four areas means that discretionary spending, after you throw in DL&R, public safety, all of the other departments which we haven't even talked about, transportation, etc., we're talking about a very little wiggle room by which we have. And because of that, ladies and gentlemen, when the budget got hit by the recession, we're scrambling. And that's part of the reason why we wanted to come to you today, because even with the recession on and with a budget deficit of $1.2 billion, using proper techniques, there's a way of making the budget balance without having your taxes increase or having the GT tax in particular, or you small business people to have those job killer bills, which I've spoken of on the floor for many months to have to come through. Before we get into that, let's talk about some of the areas that some of the highlights of this year's budget. Looking at maybe the governor's approach to it, the House and the Senate approach. Let's compare and contrast before we kind of put out what we in the Republican caucus are proposing.
Well, I would say the governor tried to do a lot of very, very creative things. Things like trying to delay tax refunds, moving around some special funds, things like that, to try to really minimize our increase in taxes. The House and the Senate have done something very different. They've cut some spending, but they've also, as you just mentioned, they've been moving some very high tax increases to try to balance.
Just last Sunday night, I think we had $270 million just at the meeting and the sitting of one committee for 1 hour. $270 million of increased taxes. And the difficulty of that is not just because of the balancing of the budget, but because that takes the money out of the economy. How economies thrive is by spending. Believe it or not, the more you spend, the better the economy is going to be. And people, when they're not spending, or when government is taking and putting that money aside, the economy slows down. So what we're going to be talking about is what are some of the reasons we can or cannot rely upon these taxes when we get to our budget. But before we leave the governor's budget, some people are concerned, I think, with the first point you said about the delayed tax refund. I understand that's $275 billion that basically the taxpayers are helping us with, giving us a loan, if you will. They're going to get their money back, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. And obviously it's going to be difficult for everybody because you either expect to save or spend that money, but it's within the law. It's not going to be a very long delay. And it does, again, it gets us $275 million that we really need right now.
So it's about a 30, 60-day, 90-day loan. Depending on if you get your taxes in early, you may have had it already, but if you haven't, after July 1, all of those due payments will be made.
Yeah, and I believe they've said that they're going to try to pay it back depending on various, there are a bunch of different variables of how they're going to pay it back. So,
speaking of the governor's budget, a little more controversial one was if you're the county or one of the counties, we're going to take away your TAT tax. What was that? What's that one all about?
I believe the governor wanted to suspend the majority of it, and the TAT is basically comes from hotel rooms, I believe, and there's been a bunch of controversy on who's going to take it and how much we should take and everything. And I think we've said maybe about 20% we think might be good. But
yeah, she's giving you a sneak preview of our budget versus. We haven't agreed with the governor who wanted to take 100%. I believe 93 million. From the transient accommodation tax, which, as Beth said, is the hotel room tax, which then is redistributed to the counties, and they have used that not just for promotion of the visitor industry, but for basically any and all things that they see are necessary and fit. And they have come one by one and said, don't take away our TAT tax. Don't do that. And the hammer, they've said, is unless you want to raise the taxes on your constituents. I represent the Hawaii Kai to Kalama Valley area. I do not want your taxes raised, and that's not why we are not held hostage to that, but to be fair, as Beth mentioned, we're going to take just 20% of the TAT tax. So it's a small amount, and right now moving through the legislature is a proposal by the Senate to take 50%, and I believe there's another one to take 10%, so they're going to be trading that back and forth.